as you can see to my right, and we're going to be speaking about healing and energy medicine to the left, and God knows what is going to happen in the middle. We're going to start with Gerald Celente, who is being Skyped in from New York. Gerald, are you there? And to start with, we'd love to ask you, we know you have limited time. What would be your understanding of the business opportunities in the breakthrough energy technologies that are beginning to come forward in our society?
Well, you know, as you may know, I've been writing about infinite energy for many years, going back to my book Trends 2000 in 1995. And to me, it's the biggest game changer on the planet. Yes, you know, I've been writing about this for many years, and to me, infinite energy, you know, a something beyond solar, wind, geothermal, or biofuel. And again, you know, I'm not an expert in this field. I only look at trends in the broader sense and bring them back to the general application. So, you know, I don't claim to be a scientist, or do I play one as the publisher of the Trends Journal. But as I look at the trends, the world is ready for it now more than anything, and an infinite energy of sorts, you know, something almost free, that's renewable and clean. And again, you know, I don't know the applications, whether it's hydrino power or coal fusion or whatever it might be, but something of that magnitude. And when I say it could be the biggest game changer, I mean that in the truest sense. Just look at America's foreign policy, or that of France or the UK or many of the Western nations. How it would change in the Middle East if there wasn't that national security issue. It's kind of like an updated version of the old spice wars, you know? So rather than spice, the new spice, of course, for the last century has been oil. And so that would change. The whole geopolitical landscape would change. It would be the biggest economic game changer as well. If you can imagine people being off the grid. And being off the grid, then you're going to have a whole new type of civilization developing, where people could really live their lives.
Gerald, I'm so sorry, but we...
As I was saying, you know,
Yes.
I wrote this book, Trends 2000, back in 95, 96. And I pointed out, I said alternative energy had been a buzzword since OPEC oil embargo of 1973. But a variety... You got me?
Yes, yes.
All right. As I was saying, I wrote this in 73, that the big issue, that everybody was talking about alternative energy. And I said in 1981, only $155 million a year went into solar research and development. A single B-1 bomber cost $250 million. So, you know, that's what it's really about. The brain power.
This is Mitchell Rabin. I'm so sorry that we've had this technical glitch, but we found a solution, because that's what we're about here at this conference. I'm going to put you on speaker from my cell phone right up to the mic. Okay? Excellent. Thanks so much for the patience. Okay, Gerald.
All right, I don't know where I left off, but... Hello?
Hello? Yes, we hear you. I think we're okay. I might have to repeat everything he's saying.
The speaker's on the back of the phone. The biggest obstacle, as I see it, is the will and the funding. And I believe that we have the brain power to do it, but not the will to create an alternative energy that could be almost free and mostly clean. And when you think that we're in the 21st century and we're still burning fossil fuels, it's quite a fossil idea. And as I've mentioned over and over again, is that this could be the biggest both economic and geopolitical game changer. All of a sudden, there are no geopolitical interests that are tied to oil. And as we just saw just a few weeks ago, with the desire for the United States to go into do some collateral damage, let us say, into Syria, and Libya last year. Most of this has to do with oil issues and Middle East control. So the will, I believe, for a real clean alternative energy is being held up by the major powers and the powers to be. I mean, when you think, for example, that $80 billion of our money, we the taxpayer, according to the Financial Times, hardly a left-wing newspaper, is going to National Security Agency to spy on us? Can you imagine what $80 billion would do in the development of an alternative energy? Something that, on the magnitude of the discovery of fire and the invention of the wheel, it would change life as we know it, and do so in a very positive way. I mean, look what's going on in China with the pollution issues. Every year you read about it. And, there's also they're having a climate change conference in China now. And the amount of people there that are aware of it, it's astronomical when you look at polling numbers. Most everyone is. So we're ready for the new alternative energy, but again, the will isn't there. When you think that the United States, and of course with the help of other scientists from other nations, was able to put together a Manhattan Project during the brief periods of World War II and come up with an atom bomb, and now we can't come up with a clean alternative energy? It's a joke, as I see it. As again, it's the will isn't there, but the need is. And if it did come, it would, again, as I said, it would solve a lot of the geopolitical and economic problems that are facing us all. And when you look at what it costs people to drive and automobiles and how inefficient the whole systems of transportation are, so much of that would change with rail and other means of transportation that could be clean and essentially energy reproducing rather than gas guzzling.
Well, you know that we're not going to be giving up, even if the powers that be or will be aren't in favor of our interests in developing free energy technologies. What do you see as how we can enter the marketplace even without something like government funding or even big corporate funding?
I was at yesterday. I'm getting some feedback. Yesterday was the bicentennial of the birth of Giuseppe Verdi. And I was at a concert up here. I'm in Kingston, New York, up in Phoenicia, just north of us, and they have this wonderful Festival of Voices. And it's outdoors, and it was at the level of Metropolitan Opera. And I thought to myself, first of all, Verdi, most of the music that he composed, he did it with the desire for the Italian people to instill in their spirit to rise up against the occupiers. In those days, it was, of course, the Austrians and the Hungarians, the Germans were there, France had a peace, Spain, the Neapolitans couldn't speak the same language as the Calabrians. So it was to unify the nation, and he did it with music. And as I was sitting there, and I thought to myself how desperately the world needs de Medicis, patrons of the arts. And to answer your question, how desperately the world needs patrons of alternative energy. I'm sick of these billionaires that want to keep making more and more billions, and they give very little or next to nothing back. These are the numbers, and I'm not making them up. 400 people in the United States have a net worth of $2 trillion. What, are they going to take this dough with them? Hey, you know, they found the bones of King Richard III under a parking lot last year. Yeah, so what are they holding on to it for? You're only dust. So the money is there. You know, and what's the fellow that's, the Hyperloop, is it called? Or the guy from PayPal that's trying to do positive things. It's that kind of money. But you have a bunch of people in this time of life where quality doesn't count. And I do corporate work, you know, at a minimum, but I'm around them all the time. And you know what their mantra is now? Quantity and efficiency. The word quality isn't even entering into their brain. So it's all there. If just a few of the people with money recognize what they can do to improve society on a global level by investing in alternative energy, then we would have it. Just like we had a renaissance because the people with the money, the de Medicis and others, put it to a use that brought the people to a higher level.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for all of your good thoughts and inspiring words and humor. At the moment we so need it. So, Gerald Celente, thank you so much for joining us here at the conference. Next time we would hope that you could join us in person. Then we don't have to bother with Skype.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Is this microphone
Yes.
working fine?
You're good.
Okay. Folks, I'm going to just give the second half of the bitter pill that I began administering yesterday. It's the only real function I serve. We are here but a gathering of souls, and perhaps a gathering which is being mirrored in another quadrant of the universe this time. Meaning to say, we are all of us here in phase conjugate dielectric, is that what it is? Dan Nunez, in heart resonance, in fellowship. And I think that is let me start by saying this, because these are the points I wanted to draw on. In the United States, an 8th grade student is facing a year in prison for wearing a t-shirt with the National Rifle Association logo. In the USA this year, a 9-year-old school child was tasered twice before being handcuffed for skipping school. On May the 4th, in the US this year, another 10-year-old boy was tasered at school, 2 barbs penetrating his chest by a policeman who wished to make a point to the boy about what happens to folks who don't obey orders. World governments spend $1,735 billion on war in 2012. 44% of that was underwritten by the United States. It would take about $135 billion, which is less than a tenth of the 2012 war chest, to eradicate poverty across the globe. The US ranks first in the world in global crime, rape, CO2 emissions, divorce rate, teen birth rate, heart attacks, plastic surgery, prisons, and prisoners. The US issued the most vaccines and yet has the worst under 5 mortality rate and high infant mortality rate on the planet. I'm nearly through. 25 members of the team who allegedly killed Osama bin Laden are dead, including the SEAL Team 4 commanding officer. 22 service veterans commit suicide each day in the United States, over 8,000 per year and rising. In 2011, only 17 US citizens were killed worldwide as a result of terrorism, including deaths in all theaters of war. About 150 people a year are killed by police in the United States, while significantly more people die from firework discharges, lightning strikes, hornet stings, and antipsychotic drugs than through the acts of terrorism. We produce food sufficient to feed over 12 billion people in this world with a population of under 7. That ends the bullet points, which are just meant to sober us into the appropriate conversation. Now, we need to ask ourselves, is this a dream of our making? Is this the world that we choose? Write the answer on a piece of paper. By all means, and put it in your pocket, because the answer is only relevant to the individual. The odd weather notwithstanding, it seems that the golden thread which binds all of our distinguished speakers today and their fantastic presentations, Catherine, I finally made your talk today, and I'm delighted, thank you, is about the need for that thing I spoke earlier about fellowship. The phase conjugate dialectic is Dan would have it. If we take nothing else from this conference, let each of us simply acknowledge one great resounding aspect of an eternal truth, and that is that we are electing to dream this dream. We are not subjects. We are the eternal witness. We are not victims. Would you like to introduce our guest?
Thank you, Sacha. I want to first thank Sacha Stone for sharing this. And bitter pill, as he so well put it, and it really does need to undergird our entire thrust of our good work with developing these technologies. So thank you, my dear friend. Yeah. Why don't you begin with Catherine, and
Indeed.
we would like to hear.
Would you mind, Catherine, just give us 3 minutes and summarize the gist of your talk today for those who weren't here? I know that's a hard ask.
Can I just tell a story?
Impossible
What were you speaking
request.
on?
Okay.
But we focus on the impossible here, so you're elected. to
Okay.
say.
How many people here have heard the red button story? Okay, so you're gonna forgive me, I'm gonna tell it again, and this gets to Sacha's question of responsibility. In the summer of 2000, I spoke to a wonderful group of people called Spiritual Frontiers Foundation, and they had asked me to give a speech called How the Money Works in Organized Crime, which later became an article called Narco Dollars for Beginners. It's up on the web, you can find it. And I was in the middle of a speech, never have an epiphany in the middle of the speech, but I did. I was in the middle of the speech, and I was talking about the fact that a Department of Justice spokesperson 2 years before had told a reporter that I was working with that the U.S. economy launders $500 billion to $1 trillion a year of all illegal money. So that's narcotics trafficking, that's financial fraud. In fact, the number's now much bigger. But $500 billion to $1 trillion a year, that makes us the global leader. So I said to this wonderful group of spiritually evolved people, what would happen if we stopped being the global leader in money laundering? So we had a little interactive conversation. They said, we would offend the people who control $500 billion to $1 trillion a year of all dirty money and the accumulated capital thereon. After many decades, you can imagine how much money that is. So I said, okay, well, let's just pretend there's a big red button up here on the lectern, and if you push that button, you can stop all hard narcotics trafficking in your community tomorrow, thus offending the people who control $500 billion to $1 trillion in the accumulated capital hereon. Who here will push the button? And out of 100 people dedicated to evolving our society spiritually, guess how many would push the button? 1. So I said to the other 99, why would you not push the button? And they said, we don't want our government checks to stop, we don't want our taxes to go up, and we don't want the value of our retirement accounts to go down, because that money would go to Singapore and Hong Kong instead of to the New York Stock Exchange. Now, Here's what I learned that day. I learned two things. First of all, let's just pretend for a second that we nominated and elected all of you to be President of the United States. You'd walk into the Oval Office and you'd turn to your sort of political guy and say, what do I do now? And he'd say, well, the American people just spent $1 billion to get you elected, and what they all want is their check. They want their Social Security check. They want their low-income housing tax credit. They want their agricultural subsidy. And so they want their check. So you turn to your Secretary of the Treasury and say, how do I get the money? And you say, you got to be nice to the people who control $500 billion to $1 trillion a year of all dirty money. Now, in Washington, everybody knows you can't make a big change in policy without at least 80% of the American people supporting you. Now, if only 1 out of 100 of the most spiritually evolved people in the country will push the red button, and you're the president, how are you going to push the red button? And that's why we see the kind of budget problems we have now. Here's the secret. The other thing I learned that day. Everyone was so afraid of having the conversation that they couldn't ask the right question, which is not how do we push the red button. The question is how do we turn the red button green? How do we make money pushing the red button? Because in fact there is a way. And part of the secret is what we talked about in the speech I gave today, which is if you look at how government money is invested by place, if you could change that at the same time you could bring in the kinds of technologies we're talking about here, there's more than enough wealth to, as Sacha was saying, end poverty, to push the red button. It's not a problem, but we need to have an honest conversation about what's really going on, and we need to take responsibility. So yes, as you listen to that list, we're describing many things the leadership is doing wrong, but if you go community by community throughout America, we're all doing it too. And that's powerful to understand that, because that means we can change. If we can change, we can turn the red button green, and that means we can push the red button.
Thank you, Catherine. That was 6 minutes. That was 6 minutes. Let me back up.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Would you pass that microphone just forward to Tom Valone, who's next, and then we'll just go a few minutes per person to do an impossible summation of what you were sharing with the people today.
Okay, here comes 90 slides into 3 minutes. I'm kind of joining this conspiracy storytelling, so I might as well tell a few that I left out of my presentation earlier. But I want to emphasize the fact that one of my slides showed Prometheus, and it's very important perhaps for some of you to understand the Promethean dilemma that we're in right now. If you examine the archetype of Prometheus, basically it's someone who stole fire from the gods. And when you think about it, the idea of using fire to burn morbid archetypal remains of our ancestors, of organisms that lived on the earth, is basically trying to bring death to life with fire, and then it's got to produce more death. That's the archetypal symbol. And the myth tells us that it's going to take a Herculean effort to free Prometheus, which is basically the humankind that's committing this crime. So if fire belongs to the gods, it should stay there, and we shouldn't be using fire. So that's my message of today. But I wanted to remind you also, since we're talking about other negative stories, there are a couple interesting stories that I've witnessed firsthand, and I find myself telling them to cameras consistently when I'm interviewed. One is the story that I experienced with Martin Fleischmann. Martin, as you know, Pons and Fleischmann were the discoverers of cold fusion in 1989. Well, a few years later, I was fortunate enough to be involved with a Naval Research Lab scientist who said, hey, Martin Fleischmann's coming to town to lecture at the lab. How about if you organize a little mini conference so we can all come over to your hotel and wherever you pick, which I picked a local nearby place, and then we can have a little seminar with Martin. He'll have fun, we'll have dinner, it'll be a good time. So we did it. We actually funded the whole thing, and Martin gave a nice little lecture. It's on video, which actually the coldfusion.org is going to actually use, apparently, in her movie. Ruby Carrot is the person I'm talking about. So the important part of my story here is that Martin decided after he's done with dinner to share with us what he called a spook story. And this is probably characteristic of what's going on even today, which has happened here at the University of Colorado as well. Martin said to us, he says, after the press conference of the University of Utah in '89, he says, I was supposed to catch my plane back to Britain, and it was a connection in San Francisco, and he says, I missed my connection, I had to check into a hotel. And as I'm turning the key to the hotel door, the phone rings in the hotel room. And stupidly, he goes and answers the phone. He says, and I went over and answered the phone, and on the other line was, this is Edward Teller, don't hang up, I have questions for you. Now, I have to interrupt my story to see if your audience is aware of who Edward Teller is. Edward Teller, Dr. Edward Teller, is the only person, the father of the H-bomb. History tells us, Scientific American had a beautiful article saying, the H-bomb would never have been invented unless Edward Teller had single-handedly bulldozed the American military into saying, we gotta make it bigger and better. And you have to use an atomic bomb to fire the H-bomb. The hydrogen bomb is, you know, about 100 times more powerful. Anyways, the point is, Edward Teller controls, you know, a good portion of the Black Project military budgets as a result of his heroic journey into the H-bomb world. So, and he's asking Martin Fleischmann, can you make a bomb out of cold fusion? That was his question. And Martin's a pacifist, and he said, you know, he reflected on his answer years later, but his answer was no. And he discouraged Edward Teller from even pursuing that route. Well, as time would tell, it basically was something that he regretted in a way, because cold fusion ended up being an explosive problem. Twice it actually caused explosions in labs through high pressure cold fusion. And years later, actually when we saw him, he says, you know, as I look back, cold fusion probably would have had a lot less ridicule if it had been classified and gotten all the funding it needed and gone the fast track to development, even though the public wouldn't benefit from it, you know. So this is the military dilemma that constantly haunts us whenever people like Martin Fleischmann, you know, do the good deed of trying to let the public know, perhaps prematurely. And I experienced a similar thing from Dr. Frank Mead, who was the director of the Air Force Research Lab for years. And I knew him personally, got to meet him in the Joint Propulsion Conference in Salt Lake City. And as soon as I shook his hand, he started dumping emotionally on me about the problems of his job. And the first thing he said is, I've constantly tried to come up with aviation innovations for the Air Force. And I roll it into my bosses, and they give me a cut in pay. He says, it's happened to me twice. He says, I was even supposed to get a $10 million grant from a congressman. And then I got a call from the Pentagon. I had to fly to the Pentagon, and the generals told me they were threatening me with a court-martial. He says, I can't be court-martialed. I'm a civilian PhD, scientist. He said, all I could understand is that they're angry, and I can't accept the money. So he was like totally discouraged, and he says his conclusion was, I'm just a storefront. Those are his exact words. He said, I'm just here to testify that research is being done, but I'm not supposed to innovate. The classified world is a very demarcated line, and as soon as civilians cross it, basically you get a slap on the hand. And they're into a 50-year history of what they call the $1 billion secret. There was a 2-hour documentary by Nick Cook, a personal friend of mine, who's an excellent journalist. So this is the what would you say, the bull in the china shop that we really have to be aware of in some way or another.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. What we see at the end of the day is that emotional healing is needed everywhere. Right? We'll get some more of that tomorrow in some of our presentations. Steve Ross, hi there.
Hi there.
If you would, talking about such matters, dealing with the subject of Royal Remington Rife is another really fine example of this kind of carrying on
Yes.
a really high quality
It is.
technology that's being suppressed.
Well, the intent of my
Rest assured.
presentation actually was to capture your interest and consciousness by supplying examples of two scientists who transcended boundaries. That really wasn't the intent, because the intent that I desired to share with the audience was our potential. And the last 10 minutes was really the focal point of why I wanted to come and share. The aspect that individuals can transcend boundaries that they believe. I want to share a quick story I didn't have time to. When I was a young guy, I lived in the Los Angeles area, and LA to Las Vegas was about a 3-hour trip. I was 21, driving in the car, and the only thing on the radio was country western music and Paul Harvey, the great commentator. So I chose Paul Harvey. He shared a story that every year at Harvard Medical School, a professor shares this story. He was in the heart division. He had 10 interns with him. They went to the bed of a man who was in a coma and was ready to die at any moment, and they were going to take over the bed. So this professor takes a stethoscope, puts it on the heart of this particular patient who was in a coma, and he says to the interns, I want you to listen to the beat. Now just listen to the wholeness of that beat. Well, the man was about to die, but each of the interns put their stethoscope one after another on the man's heart, and they said, oh, we can hear. They could hear the erratic beat, the broken heart. Well, the man didn't die that day. In fact, he comes out of the coma the next day. 2 days later, he's walking around. And then 2 weeks later, he's checking out of the hospital. When the Harvard professor comes up to him and says, wow, you're an absolute miracle. The man says, what are you talking about? He says, we expected you to die. We're going to take over the bed. And the man says, well, that's not what you told me. And the doctor says, well, what did I say to you? He says, when you told me how whole my heart was and 10 other doctors agreed, I thought it was okay. Now, he was in a coma. His heart was completely broken up. But not only did he think he was okay, he was 100% okay, and that heart was rectified. So, what are we capable of? So my presentation at this more technical group was to grab your curiosity with these incredible pictures of the bonds with atoms. But my real intent was to share what we are all capable of. And I ended my presentation by saying, everything is possible when you have a beautiful heart, an open mind, and a humble spirit.
What are you? What is each one of us doing on this planet? Are we here to pay bills? Are we here to follow a completely corrupt way of life? I am not here for that. I am not interested in a new monetary system. I am not interested in a new way of using oil. I am interested in giving a voice to those of us who were given a gift, the gift of insight into the multidimensional nature of reality. For me, the no child left behind idea means that every child is left behind. I honor with compassion and respect those who wish to continue the day-to-day grind of oil and money. And I allow in my consciousness space for those individuals who wish to hold on to their belief systems of religion, politics, and every other aspect that makes up this reality. My personal truth, as consciousness or unconscious as you wish to see it, is to seed a new reality by showing a living example of our galactic consciousness, of the connection that we have to the universe. I allow individuals to have a country that still will grind away for another 1,000 or 10,000 years. I'm inviting individuals who are already there to show the rest of the world what is possible. Not the understanding that I have the right way or the not. No, this is my truth. My talk is about healing, galactic consciousness, as being the direction of what we call breakthrough or free energy. Our free energy or breakthrough energy devices should look like something that came from heaven, not create more technology that looks like bombs. I should be able to stand next to this technology and heal my body and connect with my source. I don't care about what we can do in the next 200 or 300 years. I know what's possible right now. So as an artivist, as a transcendental visionary, these are the gifts that are working through me. This is not me. This is just a vessel. I'm building a nation called Vossa Nation. I'm tying into other projects, like the New Earth Project, hopefully, who already have a living, breathing understanding of this. So we can guide. And I'm not interested in convincing the universities. I've already played that for 20 years. I'm not interested in inviting anybody who's going to fight and try to debunk and somehow bring the misunderstandings of their fear and lack. This is a tough decision to denounce reality because it goes against a lot of what we say, well, you're Mr. Consciousness, spiritual woo-woo. You should already be accepting of everybody. No, I want to jump out of the labyrinth because I have tried it already. There is another world outside of the labyrinth where we are multidimensional, we are healing each other, we're bringing in technology that doesn't fit in any paradigm. Technology that connects us to beings in Vega or the Pleiades, or understanding that Gaia is a living, breathing entity that's part of a larger body of the galaxy. This is what I'm inviting the audience to contemplate. And if it doesn't feel comfortable, if we still want to play with physics, we still want to play with mathematics and a limited view, and say, well, let's inch it a little bit, I say you are in your freedom to do that. My approach, my truth is to just go beyond. So ask yourself again, what are we? What are you? Know thyself, and that's the truth that'll set us free. Which means when you connect to the frequency and vibration that we are so much more, you will see right through television. You'll see right through the money and oil and so forth. It will be almost like looking at a tin can with a string. I invite everyone to connect with that.
Thank you, Fernando.
No, we'll start with you, David. David Martin.
My presentation was really focused on trying to understand the essential nature of the difference between the linguistics that were born of the 1691 misquote of scripture that John Locke introduced into both politics and economy when in the opening of his testimony before Parliament, he actually misquoted, but actually his quote in 1691 was, "Money solves everything." And unfortunately, that dogma has permeated every single attribute of human endeavors at a policy level, at a structural level, and a religious level ever since. And the point that I was trying to convey in my presentation was that until we are willing to emancipate ourselves from a dependency, which is a dependency through which we become enslaved, we will have no capacity to access the multidimensionality that is actually available to us in every attribute of the cosmos. And it's ironic that despite all of the enormous amounts of effort and energy, audiences in places like this gathering, audiences in places around the world, actually, while willing to challenge assumptions that are consensus assumptions around energy, electricity, power, money, etc., are unwilling to actually hold the same degree of critique of assumptions of the monetary system. And what I tried to do is actually suggest that maybe what we need to do is actually understand that when we surrogate ourselves, our consciousness, our endeavors, and put those efforts at the mercy of that which is funded and that which is not funded, we've actually defiled the purity of the impulse that's trying to emerge. Because it turns out that the universe is one of abundant generosity. It is not one of scarcity. It's not one of proprietary enclosure. And the tools that we're using to try to emancipate energy for all humanity, if we choose to use those things which have been the manacles of society since 1691, we neither are deserving of, nor will we succeed in transforming or breaking through not only our energy, but actually the energy that's required to really reintegrate a healing strategy for the earth. I wanted to just take one moment and say that I was deeply touched by the people who were in this tent when I gave my presentation. For those of you who don't have the opportunity to do so, there is a moment in time when you realize that you're communicating to a few people who are actually resonating in an audience. And I want to deeply pay homage to the fact, and several of you know who you are, I've spoken to several of you. It was just a deep honor to be standing on this stage 10 days after being in a hospital bed, and I'm not really supposed to be standing a lot, but on a bum leg standing in front of you, I want you to know that I received so much energy and so much love and so much compassion and so much relief and so much life from you that in that moment I was deeply touched. And I am deeply grateful to each one of you who actually held that space. Thank you very much.
I'm Mark Brasche, aka Zero Fossil Fuel on YouTube, and I represent the portion of the breakthrough energy movement where I consider myself to be a member of boots on the ground in terms of motivating and energizing other people to get out and try and build something, to educate them, and to attempt to build it myself, because we're all working toward the same goal, to divorce ourselves from, as David said, the manacles that we have traditionally held to. And we believe that a true breakthrough energy, in order for a true breakthrough energy to reach critical mass in society, it must be released in a very big way, very suddenly, very reproducible. And everything that I publish on YouTube is published open source, freely to all mankind for no charge, as well as the work that Russ does here. We are very much brethren in that regard, and we are working very hard to produce a alternative solution that would allow us to divorce ourselves from the economic constraints that we are currently shackled to. And if we can just put together pieces of it as a group, we can move the entire developmental process forward so much faster when we work together as a group and in like mind together. I have been approached by many of you here at the conference who want to share your ideas with me. I've shared everything that I can with you. I do that through the YouTube videos, through live broadcasts, and by answering as many emails as I can when people do write to me with questions. I've looked into infinite number of alternative energy technologies. Some of them are viable, some not, but I'm, like Mark Dancy, testing what is viable, testing what is not, hopefully helping to create a solution that will allow us to be truly free from the bonds that shackle us to our society.
Hi, I'm Michael Riversong. It's good to see all of you again. The talk today has a lot of symbolic meaning in my own life, but every once in a while I start wondering if maybe I'm in some kind of bizarre race against whether I'm going to get enough patronage support for the arts and the energy work, or if there's going to be some complete physical collapse coming up. It's very interesting, and I don't know why I like that drama so much, but there it is. And, but one of the things that I noticed during the talk was that the idea of consciousness keeps coming up, and that's the real key. It's not about, well, take whatever job you can get, or call the Brazilian embassy and see if they'll take you in, or whatever. It's none of that. What it is that each of us has this potential to be more conscious than you can possibly imagine at the moment, and to get up to the highest level that any human can get up to. It really can happen, and it can happen to any of us at any time, and that's why we're here on this planet. And this work with the energy, well, that's one way to express this rise in consciousness. There is a general rise in consciousness going on throughout the world. It's one of the reasons why it's possible for this gathering to be happening right now. There are different ways to look at consciousness. I tend to use some scientifically developed scale methods. The first scale of consciousness, though, if you really want to get down into this subject, was written up by Dante. The 3 volumes, Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso. And that's been around for quite a while, and you can find anybody somewhere in that work, anybody's consciousness, and you can find people rising and falling all the time. And so I'm hoping that this work, over everything else, results in people coming to a greater consciousness, because if we do that, you can almost say that there's a symbolism between the types of power generation technology we use, because after all, burning wood, everybody gets sick around the smoke. Burning gasoline, well, a lot of people get sick. Running nukes, not only do people get sick, but they have to get involved in tremendous tangles of lies and deceit. But the methods that we have here, one of the odd things we keep noticing over and over again is many of the technologies we develop have medical effects before we observe energy effects. And when we know we are on track when people experience positive medical results and the resulting rise in consciousness, which always happens when somebody goes through healing. And some of these new methods have huge potential and actuality, as we're seeing it now, in creating this rise in consciousness. So we keep going for it. And so this is what I'm saying is a coda to the talk. But there's one other thing I want to mention too. Music turns out to be the fastest way to change any environment. I love all of you very deeply, and thank you so much for having me here. And I hope we get to meet again many times and keep working together, because that's part of rising consciousness too, is feeling like you're working shoulder to shoulder with fantastic people in a community.
My name is Russ, Gries, for those of you who don't know me. Basically, I'm a younger zero fossil fuel down here. And it's interesting that I ran across some of his videos, and I somehow just see a younger, I'm a younger him. It's pretty interesting, actually. My talk today was basically the only reason you're here, and that's because somebody told you. My speech was about open source and sharing of information. Basically, you're here because somebody told you, and that's sharing of information. And what it comes down to is that's an open source idea in my mind. So everything that I do is open source in the manner of sharing information freely, because if we do not share information, we will not learn. And everybody has got to do everything they can with individuals as a group. And that's why we're all here right now. So short and sweet, my basic principle is share, help people, and you'll receive the same thing. And it's pretty amazing. If you've never had the experience just to openly, freely help somebody and not do it because you want something, but do it because you're interested in helping that person, you'll get a greater gift back from somebody, or something will happen to you that's just astounding. So just keep that principle in mind. But open source, baby, that's why we're here, sharing of information. Thank you.
Just got to say that for my part, listening to everybody and being aware of the contributions all of our panelists are making to all of our lives, all of us here on the panel and all of you, it's just breathtaking, isn't it? I just would love to just offer a big applause to everybody.
I want to make a quick comment on that. This whole structure of the tables and everything else in front of you, please go beyond that. We are sitting right with you, and we're here to honor this entire audience plus the listening and watching audience across the internet.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We are one. And now, I hope everyone doesn't need to use the bathroom, but we're going to take a brief break, because when we come back, if you could please be back in about 5 to 7 minutes. Those who are in the other tent will be joining us, and so will Richard Dolan be joining us on the panel. So that's it.
And that's when we're going to engage, we'll engage the Q&A.
Exactly.
At that time.
After Richard does a little comment on his own, we'll have the Q&A with you all.